The Kensington estate had never seen chaos like this. 18 of the world's most decorated physicians crowded into a nursery that cost more than most homes, their white coats a blur of frantic movement under crystal chandeliers. Heart monitors screamed. Ventilators hissed. A team from Johns Hopkins barked orders at specialists flown in from Geneva, while a Nobel laureate in pediatric immunology wiped sweat from his forehead and whispered what no one wanted to hear. We're losing him. Baby Julian Kensington, heir to a $40 billion empire, was dying, and $50,000 an hour in medical expertise couldn't tell anyone why. His tiny body had turned the color of twilight. Blue lips, blue fingertips, a strange, mottled rash creeping across his chest like accusation. Every test came back inconclusive. Every treatment failed. And through the servant's entrance window, pressing his face against glass that had never been cleaned for someone like him, stood Leo, 14 years old, son of the night shift housekeeper, wearing a coat 3 winters too thin and shoes held together with prayer. He'd spent his whole life being invisible on this estate, the boy who walked the edges, who noticed everything because no one ever noticed him. Right now, he was staring at the potted plant on the nursery windowsill, the one that had arrived 3 days ago, the one that had left an oily, yellowish residue on the gardener's gloves that had touched the baby's crib railing during yesterday's cleaning, the one that every genius in that room had walked past 17 times without a second glance. Leo's hands trembled. He knew what it was. His grandmother, who'd healed half of Kingston's poorest neighborhood with nothing but herbs and faith, had taught him to recognize that leaf pattern before he could read. Digitalis, devil's trumpet, angel killer. The doctors were about to cut that baby open looking for answers. The answer was sitting in a ceramic pot, wrapped in a bough. Leo looked at the window, then at the security guard making rounds, then at his mother's face through the kitchen door, the woman who'd warned him 1,000 times. Stay invisible. Stay safe. Don't give them a reason to throw us out. He thought about what would happen if he was wrong. Then he thought about what would happen if he was right, and did nothing. Leo pulled his coat tight, took a breath, and ran. What would you risk to save a life that the world says isn't your business to save? Leo had learned to walk without making a sound by the time he was 6 years old. It wasn't a skill anyone had taught him. It was survival. When you lived in the groundskeeper's cottage at the edge of a billionaire's estate, a cottage so small it could fit inside the Kensington family's walk-in closet, you learned quickly that your existence was tolerated, not welcomed. You learned to move like smoke, to breathe like a secret, to become so small, so quiet, so utterly forgettable that the wealthy people floating through their marble lives never had to be inconvenienced by the reminder that you were alive. His mother, Grace, had worked for the Kensington family for 11 years. She'd started when Leo was just 3, scrubbing floors on her hands and knees while pregnant women in designer gowns stepped over her like she was part of the furniture. She'd worked through 2 miscarriages, a bout of pneumonia that nearly killed her, and the slow death of every dream she'd ever had for herself. Also, Leo could have a roof over his head and food in his belly. We are blessed, she would tell him every night, her voice soft with exhaustion and something that might have been faith or might have been denial. Mr. Kensington lets us live here. He pays for your school books. We are blessed, Leo. Don't ever forget that. Leo never argued with her. But he also never forgot the way the Kensington children looked through him when they passed, like he was made of glass, or maybe just air. He never forgot the time Arthur Kensington III had fired a gardener for making eye contact with him during a business call. He never forgot the sign on the main house's service entrance. Staff must use rear access. Visible presence on main grounds prohibited during family hours. Blessed. Sure. If you're already hooked on Leo's story, you're not going to want to miss what happens next. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single chapter of this journey. The Kensington estate sprawled across 47 acres of manicured perfection in the hills above the city. There were gardens designed by celebrity landscapers, fountains imported from Italy, and a hedge maze that had been featured in 3 architectural magazines. There was a tennis court, a helicopter pad, and a swimming pool shaped like the family crest. There was a 12-car garage filled with vehicles that cost more than most people's houses, and a wine cellar that held bottles older than Leo's grandmother would have been if she'd lived. Leo knew every inch of it. Not because he was allowed to explore. God, no. He knew it because he'd spent his entire life watching from the margins. From the tiny window of the groundskeeper's cottage. From behind the rhododendron bushes when he was supposed to be walking to the bus stop. From the shadows of the service corridor when he snuck in to bring his mother her forgotten lunch. He'd mapped the estate in his mind the way other kids mapped video game levels. He knew which security cameras had blind spots. He knew which doors were left unlocked during the 3 p.m. shift change. He knew that the head of security, a thick-necked man named Briggs, took a 20-minute smoke break behind the pool house every afternoon at 4:15. He knew these things because knowing them made him feel like he had some kind of power in a world that constantly reminded him he had none. But lately, Leo had been watching for a different reason. 3 months ago, Eleanor Kensington had given birth to a baby boy, Julian Arthur Kensington IV. The heir, the prince, the future of a dynasty built on tech patents and pharmaceutical acquisitions and the kind of generational wealth that most people couldn't even conceptualize. The baby had arrived in a flurry of magazine covers and society announcements. A professional photographer had been hired to capture his first moments. A team of night nurses rotated in 8-hour shifts. A nutritionist had been flown in from Switzerland to consult on Mrs. Kensington's diet to ensure optimal breast milk composition. Leo had watched it all from his usual place, the shadows. And somewhere along the way, something had shifted in his chest. He'd started timing his walks to school, so he'd pass the nursery window at sunrise, when the nurse would hold Julian up to see the morning light. He'd started lingering near the kitchen entrance when he knew the baby would be taken for his afternoon stroll through the gardens. He'd started feeling something he couldn't quite name, a strange, aching tenderness for this tiny person who had everything Leo would never have, but who also seemed so small, so fragile, so utterly unaware of the weight of the crown he'd been born wearing. Maybe it was because Julian was innocent. Maybe it was because Leo remembered what his grandmother used to say. Every child comes into this world pure, baby. What happens after? That's on us. Or maybe it was because Leo understood, in some bone-deep way, that he and Julian were both prisoners of circumstances they hadn't chosen. Julian would spend his life in a golden cage, performing for cameras and shareholders, and a father who saw him as a legacy rather than a person. Leo would spend his life in the margins, invisible and uncounted, his potential measured only by how well he stayed out of the way. 2 boys, 2 prisons, same estate. This story is about to take a turn you won't see coming. Make sure you're subscribed so you can follow Leo's journey to the very end. Hit that subscribe button now, you won't regret it. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Leo first saw the plant. He was walking back from school, taking his usual route along the service road that ran behind the mansion's east wing. The autumn air was sharp with the smell of dying leaves and approaching rain, and Leo had his coat pulled tight against the chill. The same coat he'd been wearing for 3 years now. The one with the fraying sleeves and the broken zipper that his mother kept promising to fix but never had time for. A delivery van was parked near the service entrance. This wasn't unusual. The Kensingtons received packages constantly, everything from rare wines to custom furniture to organic baby food flown in from organic farms in New Zealand. But something about this delivery made Leo slow his steps. The deliverman was carrying a plant. It was beautiful, Leo had to admit. About 2 feet tall, with dark green leaves that seemed to shimmer with an almost oily sheen. Pale, bell-shaped flowers hung in delicate clusters, white with purple streaks, like bruises on porcelain. The pot was wrapped in an elaborate gold bough, and a card was tucked among the stems. Old Mr. Harrison, the head gardener, met the deliverman at the door. Leo watched from behind the rhododendrons as Harrison signed for the package, his weathered hands reaching out to steady the pot. And then Leo saw it. When Harrison's fingers brushed against the leaves, they came away glistening with something. A residue. Yellowish and faintly sticky, like tree sap, but wrong somehow. Harrison noticed it too. Leo saw him frown down at his gloves, rubbing his fingers together with a puzzled expression. But then the deliveryman said something, and Harrison laughed, and the moment passed. He carried the plant inside, presumably toward the nursery where all the baby gifts were displayed, and Leo was left standing in the shadows with a strange unease coiling in his stomach. He knew that plant. He couldn't remember from where, not exactly. But something about those leaves, those flowers, that oily residue. It tugged at a memory buried deep in his mind. His grandmother's voice, maybe, from those summers he'd spent with her in Jamaica before she passed. She'd taught him about plants the way other grandmothers taught their grandchildren about baking or knitting. She'd walked him through her garden, pointing out which leaves could heal and which could kill, which flowers were medicine and which were poison dressed in pretty colors. The devil's most beautiful work, she used to say, is always wrapped in something lovely. You have to learn to see past the beauty to the danger underneath. Leo stood there for a long moment, that unease growing heavier with every breath. He thought about going to find his mother. He thought about knocking on the service entrance and telling someone, anyone, that something about that plant felt wrong. But who would listen to him? He was nobody. The maid's son. The shadow boy. He didn't even exist in the Kensington's world except as a minor inconvenience to be managed. So Leo did what he always did. He swallowed his instincts, buried his unease, and walked back to the cottage to start his homework. 3 days later, he would realize that decision almost cost a baby his life. What Leo discovers next will change everything, not just for him, but for the entire Kensington family. Don't miss Chapter 2. Subscribe now and be the first to find out what happens when the unthinkable becomes the only option. The sirens came at sunset. Leo was sitting at the wobbly kitchen table, working through a geometry problem he didn't really care about, when he heard them. Distant at first, then growing louder, closer, more urgent. He went to the window and watched as 3 ambulances came screaming up the private drive, followed by a convoy of black SUVs and 2 helicopters that descended onto the lawn like mechanical birds of prey. His mother burst through the cottage door minutes later, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Something's wrong with the baby," she gasped, already reaching for her work uniform. "Something's terribly wrong. They're calling in doctors from everywhere. I have to go help. I have to." She was gone before Leo could say a word. He stood at the window for hours that night, watching the mansion blaze with lights, watching figures in white coats rush back and forth past the nursery window, watching the shadows of chaos dance across the manicured lawns. And deep in his gut, beneath the fear and the confusion and the strange grief he felt for a baby he'd never even held, one thought kept surfacing like a body in dark water. The plant. The plant. The plant. Leo has seen something the doctors haven't. But will anyone listen to a poor boy from the margins? Subscribe now so you don't miss a single word. The Kensington mansion had transformed into a war zone. Leo had never seen anything like it. Through the nursery window, the same window he'd pressed his face against 1,000 times to catch glimpses of baby Julian sleeping peacefully in his hand-carved Italian crib, he could now see nothing but chaos. White coats everywhere. Machines he couldn't name blinking and beeping and screaming in electronic panic. Hands moving with frantic precision, injecting, adjusting, measuring, failing. Always failing. He'd crept closer than he should have. Much closer. The security teams were too distracted by the medical emergency to patrol their usual routes, and Leo had slipped through the hedge maze like a ghost, positioning himself behind the ornamental fountain where he had a clear sight line into the nursery's floor-to-ceiling windows. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. Baby Julian, tiny, precious Julian who Leo had watched learn to smile at the morning light, was the color of a bruise. His small body lay in the center of a medical hurricane, surrounded by more equipment than Leo had ever seen in one place. Tubes snaked from his arms. Monitors tracked heartbeats that stuttered and stumbled like a drunk man walking home. And his skin, God, his skin was this terrible grayish blue, mottled with a rash that seemed to spread even as Leo watched. He looked like he was dying. He looked like he was already dead and just hadn't realized it yet. If this story is gripping your heart the way it gripped mine writing it, you need to subscribe right now. What happens next will stay with you forever. Don't miss it. The doctors had started arriving within an hour of the first ambulance. Leo had counted them as they came. Black cars and helicopters depositing an army of medical royalty onto the Kensington lawn. He'd heard his mother whispering their names to another maid in terrified reverence as she rushed past the cottage. Dr. Heinrich Voss from the Geneva Institute of Pediatric Medicine. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the Tokyo neurologist who'd saved the Japanese Prime Minister's grandson. Dr. Michael Sterling from Johns Hopkins, whose waiting list was 3 years long and whose fee was rumored to be $50,000 just for a consultation. Dr. Amara Okonkwo, the Nigerian-British immunologist who'd been nominated for a Nobel Prize. Dr. Samuel Chun, Dr. Rebecca Morrison, Dr. Alexander Petrov, Dr. Isabella Ruiz. 18 of them. 18 of the greatest medical minds on the planet. Each one carrying degrees from institutions Leo could never hope to attend. Each one armed with knowledge that had taken decades and millions of dollars to acquire. 18 experts. And not a single answer. Leo could see them through the window, arguing now. Dr. Voss was gesturing emphatically at a chart, while Dr. Sterling shook his head. Dr. Tanaka had stepped back from the group, her arms crossed, her expression troubled. A younger doctor, Leo didn't know his name, was running yet another blood test while a nurse changed yet another bag. They were lost. Leo could see it in their body language, in the way their confident postures had begun to crumble as the hours passed. These titans of medicine, these gods of the healing arts, were standing in a $40 million nursery with every resource on earth at their disposal, and they had no idea why a 3-month-old baby was dying in front of them. Arthur Kensington stood in the corner of the room, and Leo had never seen a man look so broken. The billionaire who commanded boardrooms and crushed competitors and moved through the world like he owned it, which, in many ways, he did, was clutching his wife's hand with white-knuckled desperation. Eleanor Kensington hadn't stopped crying for hours. Her designer dress was wrinkled, her perfect makeup destroyed, her society page composure shattered into a million pieces on the Italian marble floor. Their baby was dying, and all their money couldn't save him. This is the moment everything changes. But you'll only see it if you're subscribed. Hit that button now. Leo's about to do something that will shock everyone, including himself. Leo watched the doctors cycle through their theories. Bacterial infection. They pumped Julian full of antibiotics that did nothing. Viral inflammation. They tried antivirals that made no difference. Autoimmune response. They administered immunosuppressants that didn't suppress anything. Genetic disorder. They ran tests that came back inconclusive. Allergic reaction. They shot him with epinephrine that might as well have been water. Each theory emerged with confidence and collapsed in confusion. Each treatment was administered with precision and failed with cruelty. Leo watched it all through the window, his hands pressed against the cold stone of the fountain, his heart hammering against his ribs. Because he knew something they didn't. He knew about the plant. It was still there. He could see it from where he crouched. Sitting on the windowsill of the nursery, its pale bell-shaped flowers catching the harsh medical lights, its dark leaves shimmering with that oily sheen. The doctors walked past it constantly. They adjusted their equipment around it. They set their coffee cups and tablets and medical charts down next to it without a second glance. It was invisible to them, part of the background. Decoration. Just like Leo. He remembered his grandmother's lessons now, the memories surfacing with painful clarity. They'd been sitting on her porch in Kingston, the summer he was 9, and she'd been showing him pictures in an old book with a cracked leather spine. This one here, she'd said, pointing to an illustration of bell-shaped flowers that looked almost exactly like the ones in the nursery. We call it devil's trumpet. The fancy doctors call it digitalis. Beautiful, yes? But the oils on those leaves, just touching them can slow a man's heart right down. And if you're small, if you're a baby, she'd shaken her head slowly. Even breathing the air around it too long can poison the blood. Leo's grandmother had known things that no medical school taught. She'd learned her healing arts from her mother, who'd learned them from her mother, who'd learned them from ancestors who'd had nothing but the plants around them and the wisdom passed down through generations of survival. She'd delivered babies in homes with no electricity. She'd cured fever